In the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate, and may all praise be to Allah, Lord of the worlds, and His blessings be upon His messenger. I would like, first of all, to thank our colleagues at the Arab Center and all those who are helping organize and run this conference, and to all our participants. Thank you and God bless. And I would like to welcome all our followers through the social media and Zoom application. Our conference, which is entitled The Protracted Arab Civil War Causes and Challenges. Today we are on the second day, and this is panel 3 on the roles of regional powers, spoilers, guarantors, or resolvers. And we will be discussing this and the other aspects. And for those who are striving to achieve a dignified life and equal opportunity and social justice, and those who are either in government who oppose that, I don't necessarily agree with the definition of civil war, because there is the added dimension of the outside powers, whether regional or international, and the situations in Libya and Syria are the best examples. We see the foreign mercenaries who take part in the fighting very actively. I will move now to the first paper by Dr. Harith Hasan on the Iranian role in the Iraqi conflicts, and also the Dr. Harith now is a non-resident senior fellow at the Malcolm Carr at Carnegie Middle East Center. He holds a PhD in political science from Santa Ana School of Advanced Studies. Dr. Harith Hasan, you have 15 minutes. Thank you very much, and thank you to the Arab Center for this kind invitation. As you said, I will be focusing on the role played by Iran in the internal conflicts in Iraq, and especially in the post-ISIS era. Basically, I argue by saying that at the time when the Iranian intervention reflects a classical example in situation where two neighboring countries with similar religious, cultural, and factional and sectarian similarities. Most studies on foreign intervention on civil wars are commonplace either on the side of governments or on the side of rebels. In Iran's intervention in Iraq was rather different, because Iran decided to side with some either military or semi-military militias who are in one context allies of the Iraqi government, and on other incidents adopt differing and opposing views and positions to that of the government, yet Iran has sided with them. And the Iranian intervention came in different forms, like forming, arming groups, educating them, doctrinization of these fighters, and also to the point of deploying military personnel on their side. To understand the Iranian intervention, we have to take into consideration three factors. First of all, the structure of the Iranian religious system in Iran, which is based on Shiaism, Islam, and Iranian nationalism, and also the narrative of the necessity to stand up to American hegemony in the region. So therefore, the Iranians intervene through this factor. Secondly, the role Iran took in the post-Saddam Hussein era, especially when the Sunni-Shia divide took a political and military confrontation aspect, and also the Shiite Islamist parties who also were supported by Iran and some Gulf countries and Turkey, which supported some Sunni factions. This is what the third party intervention contours and this, I mentioned now transnational dimension of civil war and other studies which all agree that the linkages between one side of one aspect of the affiliations of these forces with a neighboring country, and in Iran's case specifically the Shiite doctrine. Normally when there is a power vacuum or a change as what happened in Iraq in 2003 and also there is the role of the past narratives in these conflicts. In this case, we note that there is a rich history of conflict over a long time, and Iraq was the arena for struggle between the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Empire, and also even Iran under the Shah supported the Kurdish rebel groups, and then came the Iran-Iraq war and the Saddam Hussein regime, which wanted to benefit from the change in the situation in Iran. Jacob Cartman, Civil War, Diffusion and Regional Motivation for Intervention. This is a very appropriate study. And please, Dr. Harith, can you just slow down a little bit? Hence the importance of 2003 after the American invasion and the demise of the Saddam Hussein regime upset the old balance, and also more Iraqi strife came into existence. The Iranian regime's doctrine is based on harboring skepticism vis-a-vis outside Iran's national security strategy is a good example. This kind of identity and perspective makes Iran's intervention outside as part of Iran's preemptive and preventive intervention outside. They consider America's occupation of Iraq as a threat to them. Secondly, they consider the Sunni groups as a threat to Iran. And thirdly, the Iran-Iraq war has made the Iranians think that the Saddam Hussein regime was a proxy effort to defeat the Islamic Revolution. Therefore, they think their intervention in Iraq is not an act of hegemony, but is a preventive measure against the enemies of the Islamic Revolution through the alliance of the US, Israel, and the conservative Sunni Arab states. I remember one former Iraqi official told me that he and a colleague of his met Qasem Soleimani, and Soleimani asked them on one thing: does the United States intend to invade Iran after Iraq? So I move from this intervention to the Iranian intervention as third-party intervention. Lindsay and Turan and Jones say in their third-party intervention, the civil process, say that this kind of intervention can have any of the impacts, either expedite the victory of the government or expedite the opposition's victory, or reaching a political assessment. I think in Iran's intervention, this has strengthened the hand of the Shiite political groupings who allied with the government against ISIS, and the Iranian intervention between 2003 and 2011 was on the defensive. The American presence was the strongest, and Iran's role was to help Iraqi Shiite forces to face up to what appeared to be a Sunni insurrection, especially between 2003 and 2007. And Iran's focus was on Badr organization and Al-Mahdi army, and the Revolutionary Guard started forming the so-called special groups to wage operations against American forces, which became later on the well-known militias like Asa'ib Ahl al-Haq and Hezbollah of Iraq. Then came the period between 2011-2014, after the American military withdrawal and the rise of ISIS and their occupation of 1/3 of Iraqi territory. The third phase is from 2018 until now, which is the period of consolidating the influence of the government, which was aided by the Iranian intervention. And this saw a decisive victory for the sake of those who fought ISIS. And when ISIS tried to establish a separate Sunni state in Iraq, then the victory by the quasi-military groups, the Shiite groups, which were organized and helped and aided by the Revolutionary Guards, who defeated the Sunni groups. And in this confrontation, and as a result of the collapse of the Iraqi army, Iran expanded them and provided them with legitimacy politically and militarily. When in 2016 the Iraqi parliament called for integrating these Shiite militias, popular mobilization or Hashd Sha'bi, with the Iraqi army, and the edict by Ayatollah Sistani of establishing the Hashd Sha'bi. The Hashd Sha'bi has two identities: the national identity as a group of militias allied with the government or the Iraqi state and get their budget from Iraq. So therefore, the victory over ISIS is a victory for them. Secondly, their doctrinal aspect, when they are armed and educated and indoctrinated by the Revolutionary Guard, armed with Shiite ideology, and this means that they can turn against the state and the government when the government adopts positions which they consider are contrary to their doctrine, and this is what happened in the days of Haydar al-Abadi and Mustafa al-Kadhimi. So therefore, this popular mobilization force is of two identities, one which belongs to the state and one can be against the state. And to understand the role of Iranian intervention in the civil war or the internal war, maybe the internal war is more accurate. Iran, of course, was the main guarantor of these Shiite forces, and sometimes they are guarantors of the state, and they play the role of moderator between the government on the one hand and the Shiite and Sunni forces. You have 3 minutes. So therefore, Iran actively plays a role in deciding the conflict and to give themselves the role of a guarantor, which the US used to play. And also, at the same time, they try to limit the independence of the Iraqi state and deprive it from the ability of impacting Iran's interests if they decided to adopt positions against Iran. So therefore, the Revolutionary Guard sided with the Syrian regime and used the popular mobilization forces in Syria, despite the fact that they are financed by the Iraqi state. The role or the aim of Iranian intervention went beyond just siding with the government against ISIS. They tried to reformulate the balance of power in Iraq in order to make sure that the Iraqi government takes positions either in favor of Iran or at least not against Iran, and have the deterrence to deprive the Iraqi government of taking any positions against Iran. Thank you, Dr. Harith, and he covered many points which require more research, and I'm sure we'll have more of these points raised later on.
Now we'll move to the second paper. Dr. Imad Mansour and Wiliam Thompson will be talking about the Rivalry-Civil war, Farrago in the MENA. Dr. Imad Mansour is the Assistant Professor at the Critical Security Studies Program at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies and a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute in Washington. Dr. Imad, 15 minutes, please, the floor is yours. Thank you, Doctor. Allow me to invite my colleague, Professor Thompson. Please, the floor is yours, sir. You can start.
You want to give him the chance?
Please, because he goes first and then go after, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so when two people try and give a presentation, you have to watch the clock a little more closely. I'll try and be fairly quick. We are not long-established students of civil war, and the explanation for our being here is that one thing leads to another. We started off looking at rivalries, interstate rivalries in MENA. We finished that project a year or two ago. We moved on to regional order. And when you're doing regional order, it's very hard to get around the fact that civil wars keep popping up here and there, and they seem to be fairly prominent. The more we looked at civil wars, the more we realized we were back into the domain of interstate rivalries. So what we are looking at now is a third project on the relationship between rivalry and civil wars. It is a very complex and confusing mixture of various elements if you try and integrate the abstract theoretical materials on the role of rivalries in civil war. And that's why we call it a Farrago, which is an old English term for a confused mixture of different elements. The appeal of this kind of a project is fourfold. We always talk about integrating international and domestic politics. We never do it. We have no choice in this topic. It is something we simply cannot escape. Secondly, the study of international relations used to be dominated by the study of war. War became more scarce. People moved on to civil wars. But it's become more clear now that there really isn't a movement from war or interstate war to intrastate war. It's more that civil wars have become a proxy or a surrogate for interstate wars. And therefore, in some respects, it's more of the same as before. And we need to appreciate that civil wars are not a purely domestic kind of phenomenon. Thirdly, we are committed to making rivalry and its analysis more explicit, and we hope to do that in this project. And finally, and unfortunately, civil wars have become very common in Middle Eastern politics, and therefore are very much in need of explanation and analysis. Now, if you would show that first table one slide, Imad. Well, the table has a
yes,
list.
yes, it's on.
It's on? Okay. I can't see it, but I'll trust you. It's a table taken from the Correlates of War list of civil wars. It has all kinds of problems, and we only use it to show that there is variation between wars, civil wars that are more or less internationalized. For the Correlates of War, there is a fairly conservative list. It requires actual foreign participation by troops. And obviously, there are various ways in which civil wars become internationalized. We would argue that probably almost all civil wars have been internationalized in the Middle East. But the point is that some are more internationalized than others. In particular, the wars that are missing from this list, because it ends in 2007, Sudan, Syria, Yemen, and Libya demonstrate that quite strongly. So moving on to the actual model of relationships between civil wars and rivalry, and this is where the Farrago comes in. If you start at the bottom of the figure, I won't go through all the boxes and arrows. It looks like Custer's Last Stand, I realize. But the point is that in the literature on international relations, the entry point is right from the beginning of states as they become captured by their threat environment. Some states will develop tendencies to acquire resources and centralized power to respond to threats coming from rivals. So it begins right from the very beginning, and that leads to more autocratization. It leads to more buildup of military capabilities. It leads to state repression of dissidents, which in turn leads to civil war in some cases. Once the civil war is either contemplated or becomes a possibility, outside actors have various kinds of incentives to become involved, either because they appreciate the opportunity to overthrow a particular regime or at least cause it problems, or because they think they should be defending a regime. And then there's also a second set of considerations. If a rival gets involved, then you have to become involved to defend the other side, and you get into that kind of a situation. In any event, the balance between rebels and state become affected by whether or not foreign intervention provides resources to the rebels or to the state, and they provide resources in all kinds of types, ranging from support, verbal support, to outright military intervention. That leads to a escalation in the type of civil war that's ongoing, which becomes a problem for how the war is actually prosecuted and or terminated. That is to say that there are too many veto players that become involved, and the control of the situation becomes much more difficult, leading to longer civil wars and more lethal civil wars. So we've sort of gone in a clockwise fashion around to most of these factors. Now, the problem is this model is a meta-integration of about 4 or 5 models that you can find in the literature, as well as a number of hypotheses that are floating around loosely, is not a simplification of reality. It is too close to reality to do anything straightforwardly with. What we're going to have to do is break the model into bits and pieces and try and apply them to the actual cases that we have, and see if we can test whether or not they have some kind of value added to our explanation. We do not necessarily accept the implications of all those arrows and boxes, but we have some reason to think that they may have a role to play in explaining how rivalry and interstate wars and intrastate wars are related. And so I think that's my end of the presentation. And I'll turn it over to Imad, who has our first case, or first set of cases to discuss.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. Thank you for the audience, and really thank you for the Arab Center and for the Strategic Studies Unit.
الأستاذ عماد نشكر الأستاذ توماس.
Would like to thank Mr. Thompson, the distinguished professor, and Donald A. Rogers, professor emeritus at the Department of Political Science at Indiana University. His academic interests focus on international relations theory, conflict processes, and international political economy. Mr. Thompson has covered the Middle East, and he provided us with food for thought. Now the floor is yours, Mr. Imad. Thank you, Mr. Rashid.
على كلامك، يعني حضرتك لما أنت بدأت بالحديث على أن هنالك حاجة لإعادة.
When you have talked about the necessity to revisit the concept of the civil war, part and parcel of what we do is revisiting indeed the concept of the civil wars by and large. I will speak in English. Since Mr. Thompson has spoken in English, obviously, I'll carry on.
We can really feel them later. So I want to really highlight that what we are doing here is we are trying to think through this really complex farrago that Bill set out. And what we are going to do in this paper, really specifically for this conference, is to think through, right? So if our also thinking is a bit clouded, hopefully we'll maybe really clarify it in the Q&A, how the farrago works. So to do that, we selected part of the puzzle or part of the problem, which is how do civil wars act as mediating really events or conditions between rivalries and between changes or impact on the regional order. So we think of civil war as this, step that mediates between a rivalry and the regional order, the shape of the regional order. And to do that, we looked at a variety of cases, and we decided that one interesting and really important case that allows us to test this, some of the arguments, is Lebanon. Now, this is a case that gives us at least 2 observations that allow us very different lessons. To think of Lebanon, though, I need to have or to really very briefly present important foundations of the Lebanese political system that allow us to understand how it acts, or how the civil wars in Lebanon act as a mediator between rivalry and the regional order. 4 features for the political system in Lebanon that have been built in since independence, and they really persist until today. The first is that the political system accords rights to confessions whose interests override any attempt to deny them being final arbiters of policy. So confessions are main actors. They're the agents of politics. Two, there's a wide base, or then there's really a necessary need for the base to support the leadership of this community. That's the second feature. The third feature is that intra-confessional alliances are encouraged. They're a central really feature, and they help really elites and leaders build support among their respective communities, mobilize really resources, and channel really capacities from the state. The fourth important feature, and this is very critical, because really Lebanon is very unique in a way in that sense. Confessional leaders agreed to the intervention of external patrons to back their domestic projects. So really the political system in Lebanon is built inherently on inviting external intervention. So those external really parties work to influence the power really dynamics within the country. Now, what we also try to do in this paper is to highlight how the dominant approach to seeing Lebanon through exclusively a confessional lens is sort of inaccurate. I know it's very dominant, but it is inaccurate. So we try to highlight a class-based understanding of the politics of Lebanon. We do that in a chapter, but really this is part of the larger book that we're working on. Looking at class allows us to understand the sources of support for various external parties into Lebanon. It allows us to understand really the position of Iran, Saudi Arabia, Syria, the PLO. It allows us to understand where those external actors found domestic support, why there were actors in Lebanon, for a lack of a better word, Lebanese, able to support them. Not willing, but also able, meaning even if they wanted to, they could not have. But they wanted to, and they were able for long periods of time in different ways to support or to invite external intervention and to support the projects of external actors in Lebanon. Syria and Lebanon, the PLO in Lebanon, Iran and Lebanon found good roots within really the Lebanese community. So one of the important really literature that we base our argument on goes back, for example, to Hamad Batatu's really seminal work on Iraq, but also explaining the war in Syria and the 80s, and really highlighting the class dimension as the important really cleavage in the country. Or the work of Sadiq Jalal al-Azm arguing as to why we should rethink the essence of civil wars in Syria and in the region as a whole. So we try to do a critical really approach to the civil war analysis of Lebanon. We do that through two observations, and I'll be quick with them here. One is the 1958, what's known as the crisis in Lebanon. Now, this was really a protracted 2-year process whereby the outcome, again, keep in mind, we're talking about a model that's that has a feedback effect that's very really prominent. So the outcome of the 56 tripartite invasion of Egypt galvanized support among many Lebanese for the project of Egypt in Lebanon and for the really broader projects of Pan-Arabism. What it also that did is to heighten the sense of insecurity among many other factions in Lebanon. Now, what I should highlight is, in thinking about Lebanon, we don't think of a state in the Westphalian sense. My argument is that there never was a state in Lebanon in the Westphalian sense. What there was, and there still is, a division of sovereignties among factions in Lebanon, among really sectarian groups in Lebanon. Those groups fight with others not because they perceive an infringement on the state, but because they perceive an infringement on their sovereign right to issue laws and to govern their own spaces. So this is really the essence of the politics in Lebanon. So in 1958, we reach a point where some factions feel that they need to have a greater integration with the Arab environment. And those were cross-sectarian, by the way. So you have the patriarch of the Maronites, standing in line with many of the quote-unquote Muslim really establishment in Lebanon, opening up the doors to talks, fighting against also the Christian leadership in Lebanon, to allow for more integration or more intranational really dialogue, rather than being subjected to the pressures of the United States that was very really prominent after the Suez War. So intrasectarian really politics, or the politics of the country, meant that there was there were two camps really fighting. One was seeing really the benefits of being pro-Nasserite, pro-Egyptian, and one seeing the benefits of being pro-American. Of course, the rivalries here were most important between the Soviet Union and the United States. The outcome of this very brief really interval of civil war was that the Soviet Union and the United States, they started establishing their form of involvement in the region. In particular, for the United States, where 1958 was the first instance of an American military involvement in the Middle East. That was very prominent for the US and has since defined modes of American involvement in the region. So then this civil war led or helped really define the Soviet Union and the United States work in Lebanon, or through Lebanon, sorry. The second, it signaled that this nascent rivalry, proto-rivalry, if you want, latent really, we can really think about it, in different ways. This competition between Egypt and the United States sent clear signals that Egypt now is a power broker, that Egypt has to be taken very seriously from the United States. That is very important for the regional order, because it set Egypt as a defining really feature of the regional order, and it allowed the United States and the Soviet Union to set the tone of the region for the decade or so to come, at least in their own really relations. It did nothing, the civil war did nothing for the political system in Lebanon. So if you go back to the Farrago, you'll see, talk about capacity building, state building. The political system didn't change, meaning the same really system which saw confessions as the corporate actors remained. There was no independent state. There's no actor who was distant from all others in Lebanon that was able to strike a change in the political arrangement, and it continued into the 60s and the 70s. What we see in the 60s and 70s was the increasing marginalization of a large segment of the Lebanese population, a trend that had really started in the 19th century. A lot of the Lebanese were not living in the Paris of the Orient, and really many people, many analysts miss out on understanding the politics of Lebanon because they're caught up in the idea that it was a haven for a long period of time. It was the Paris of the Orient, it was the Switzerland of the East. That was not the case empirically. Many Lebanese were living in abject poverty and very precarious really conditions in large cities, in shanty towns around large cities, and really peripheral areas in the country. And those people really starting to be they started to be mobilized in the 60s and the 70s. So they formed...
دكتور لدينا 3 دقائق لو سمحت.
3 دقائق. The story of Lebanon...
About 3 minutes.
About 3 minutes, yes.
It's not a secret. So I'm going to highlight how 2 instances, 2 observations in the 75 to 90 war help us understand the relationship between rivalries and regional order with, again, the civil war as the intervening dimension. The first really observation is that between the PLO and Syria that occurred in Lebanon after the exit of the PLO from Jordan. So we see the war in Jordan, right? Bill said that this is not an easy thing to do, and it's a complex, figure, and we agree. Oh, I obviously agree. The shock to the system in the region was the civil war in Jordan in 1970 that influenced Lebanon with the movement of the PLO. The PLO didn't come into a very neutral and consolidated really set of politics in Lebanon. It entered into a very polarized really political sphere. An impoverished set of Lebanese really supported the role of the PLO, but also many rich people supported the role of the PLO. So the divide along class lines also was complemented by a divide along ideological lines to the role of the PLO in Lebanon. Thus, the PLO found kind of a supporting base within Lebanon. Syria entered into Lebanon to very really briefly and directly, it eradicated the presence of the PLO. It exited the PLO from Tripoli and then again from, really previously from Beirut. In that sense, through the civil war in Lebanon, Syria was able really to demonstrate then when its national interest was important, it's able to act against a very important actor of a high symbolic value, which is the PLO and what it represented to the Palestine cause. So it was able to act against the PLO, no qualms, no questions asked, even if that had given some semblance of a signal that intersected, even if indirectly, with Israel's own interests. So that was important. It signaled those interests of Syria to the regional order or to the regional relations. What it did more concretely is it set Syria as a stabilizer or a spoiler to the regional order, that Syria can act now via Lebanon to either really provoke tensions in the region, but also to try to act as a stabilizer when that is very necessary. The second case, and I will end here, the Iran really Saudi Arabia intervention in Lebanon, which came really later in the decade, in the 80s, and it continues until today, should really be looked at through the prism of marginality in Lebanon, of socioeconomic disenfranchisement in Lebanon, to help us understand why Iran has been able to strike deep roots within many communities in Lebanon. And the work of Waddah Sharara in the 90s remain the undisputed final really testaments to understanding Hezbollah and Iran in Lebanon. Al-Umma al-Qaliqa wa Hezbollah wa Dawlat Hezbollah. Those two important books, Al-Umma al-Qaliqa wa Dawlat Hezbollah. So Iran really Saudi Arabia allowed Iran really to demonstrate its attachment through a lot through many of the Lebanese in Lebanon, through social services, economic support, at a time when the own quote-unquote institutions and state in Lebanon had abandoned them, and their own political elites did not see a need to support them. That allowed Iran over time to stand up as a very important actor in the Levant. And so it allowed Iran an arm to counter Israel and the United States, and it allowed Iran that very important regional exposure that it invested in the years to come to circumvent and undermine American initiatives in the region. So through the case of Lebanon, through understanding the politics of Lebanon and why the civil war opened up those opportunities for rivals, we better understand the relationship between rivalry and regional order. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop here. And obviously there's a lot of gaps in what I said. If there's any more, we can address them maybe in the Q&A. Thank you.
شكرا دكتور عماد.
Thank you, Dr. Imad, for this complementary paper to what Mr. Thompson has said. You've talked about the Lebanese civil war, the Lebanese case, and the different regional actors. Now we'll move to the third paper, the Russian and Turkish interventions in the Libyan civil war and the ramifications thereby. Mr. Emadeddin Badi will be talking to us, and he's a senior analyst at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crimes North Africa and Sahel Observatory, as well as an advisor for Libya at the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance. 15 minutes for you, sir. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Shukran jazilan, Dr. Rashid.
For the invitation. I want to first of all start off by commending Dr. Harith, Dr. Wiliam, and Dr. Imad for the excellent presentations. I think there were great points mentioned that highlighted different historical and consequently thematic kind of turning points of regional orders and domestic dynamics that consequently affected actually modalities for interventionism, proxy warfare, or surrogate warfare, and or security assistance as of late, at least. My contention is that in the past 5 years, kind of, Libya has become the laboratory for basically a mix of lessons learned from the past 40 years on how to conduct this new form of surrogate warfare, basically. I think part of that is related to the American-European vacuum left post-2011, and also the fragmentation that we as a country experienced, and the erosion overall of overarching multilateral, let's say, norms from the post-Cold War era. But the focus of the paper is actually on the past 2 years. So my paper kind of focuses on the dyadic relationship between Turkish and Russian interventionism in Libya from the vantage point of security assistance. So I'm not looking, well, I am looking, but not directly at other modalities of interventionism that transcend the security kind of dimension of things. So the research questions in my paper are basically how are the decisions made when it comes to security assistance from Russia and from Turkey to Libya? How do international local negotiations kind of take place? What level of command, what type of expertise there is? And if any knowledge is transmitted through training, capacity building, and mentoring programs, for instance, because both of these entities operate those in Libya. How are networks between these two poles, let's say, with local parties cultivated? And last but not least, how do weapons kind of infrastructure and other facets that are more, let's say, tangible enter and shape the local context in a way? Is there a way that is affecting the local kind of proxy dynamics? As you know, these two states kind of swooped into Libya following the launch of Khalifa Haftar's offensive on Tripoli in April of 2019. But they've been arguably more successful than other players at maximizing their ability to advance their respective perceived strategic interests, obviously with disparities, and none of them have actually reached their end game. But if we want to look at things holistically in the past, let's say 10 years, in a very brief period, these two players have effectively rolled back interventions by other regional players that have far outweighed them, both in terms of magnitude, in terms of weapon and funds transferred, and also on a time scale. So it was quite quick in terms of their ability to advance their interests. So my argument here, or basically what I'm looking at, is how they modeled their respective blueprints for security assistance in Libya, with the broader aim of advancing their respective strategic interests, and how they cooperate, if at all, as well. So at the level of Turkish and Russian state or non-state apparatuses. So it's a complex article, to say the least, but I think the multidimensionality is the way to look at things when it comes to Libya. Now, the method or the methodology is both one of process tracing. So I'm looking at different turning points in the Libyan conflict from 2018 onwards, with a brief backgrounder on the interests of these two states before, both during the Gaddafi era and post-revolution, and also primary interviews, because some of the information, especially around, for instance, mercenary deployment, etc., I need to have interviews conducted both in Libya and outside of Libya. So I actually have a Syrian co-author, since the paper has since been expanded to look at Turkish and Russian cooperation also in Syria, basically. But overall, there are several kind of findings, let's say, although I'm not quite done yet, but there are several lessons to extrapolate on Turkey and Russia's approaches to security assistance, on the efficiency or lack thereof of this model within the context of a hybrid security sector, since this is what we're dealing with in Libya, and also interplay between security assistance, conflict dynamics, and peace settlements since the 2018 to 2021 era overlapped with a peace settlement, or at least, although a precarious one, in Libya. Now, without getting into the background of why or how these states intervened, I think I would be doing a disservice to all of you, since most of you already know. But I think what maybe has come out to me, or what the Turkish and Russian interventions in Libya contradict in terms of normative assumptions about proxy warfare, so to speak. And I agree with Dr. Rashid about the fact that maybe proxy warfare is not exactly the right term for it, but it contradicts three things from my perspective. One is that plausible deniability is not exactly of paramount concern to these states, so their utilization of local proxies or their leveraging of the deficiencies of local actors is not leveraged, or is not geared in a way that specifically masks their involvement. That's not the primary goal, or the goal is not to have plausible deniability, so to speak. So they don't effectively actively deny interference, although you wouldn't hear from a Russian state official that they have intervened in Libya. But they are geared in a way where they are actually aiming to maximize the dependency of local actors on their presence, basically. So, for instance, if you look at the Turkish case, the provision of security assistance is effectively publicized in order to assure, or was at least publicized in order to assure local partners that, one, they have their backs, and two, also signal to other foreign players that they are present, so as a means to dissuade them from further escalation, let's say. The second kind of thing that is maybe that is contradictory about the security assistance blueprint is that these strong sponsors are not effectively gearing their interventionism in a way that imposes their will on the weak proxies. They've already identified that the proxies that they have might be able to seek support elsewhere, first of all, or might not act according to the sponsor's will. So their intervention is actually geared to be able to override the local proxy's will, regardless of what happens. So that's part of the reason why I'm focusing on security assistance, because the way the intervention of Turkey and of Russia, with the focus on controlling military bases, with the focus on deploying mercenaries from other contexts, and the way they have not exactly conducted capacity building of local forces in a way that increases or decreases, the capacity gap between local proxies and the sponsors, that is all conducive to being able to actually achieve autonomy and limited buildup of capacities with local parties. So they've already identified that they have unreliable, so to speak, partners, and they're doing things in a far more autonomous way. The last maybe point that I'll mention is traditionally the use of proxies, or why it emerged as a kind of model, was to avoid, in a way, major wars between states. So that's the conventional wisdom about proxies, but and to limit actually the confrontations to proxy actors. But I think with Turkey and Russia, the issue is not escalation, so to speak, or the issue is not the escalatory potential use of the proxy forces. They're not necessarily geared to avoid a major war. The only thing, the differentiating facet is that they're open to striking bilateral and at times multilateral arrangements, taking into account their regional, economic, and sometimes domestic interests, to avert a protracted, or more importantly, costly conflict. This is where maybe there's a difference between the Libyan and the Syrian context, because Syria borders Turkey, whereas Libya doesn't directly affect Turkey, or developments in Libya do not directly affect Turkey, but they would have no problem with an escalatory kind of type of conflict. The only issue is it would be protracted, probably come with a certain degree of reputational damage. And third of all, most importantly, actually, it would be quite costly if they have to incur the costs on their own. So that's part of the reason why I'm linking also this paper to the peace settlement that we had, because it was both of these players' kind of assessment in June of 2019 and June of 2020 that it was best from an economic, let's say, perspective to avert further escalation, both because they didn't have the military capability to transition from a defensive kind of proxy setup to an offensive proxy setup, which is far more costly, but also because from an economic and also network standpoint, they couldn't rely on the local parties to actually guarantee them access to the resources they needed to continue the conflict, as it were. So I'll leave it at that. Maybe we can discuss more in the Q&A, actually.
نشكر الدكتور عماد.
Thank you, Dr. Imad, for his presentation, and he connected the dots on many important issues. In the last hour or so, we have alluded to many important issues. This area has seen some protracted civil wars for a long time. We wonder for how long would the bloodshed continue. Anyway, we maybe can discuss that now if we open the floor for the discussion. So please, if you have any interventions, any questions, the floor is open now. Is there any questions? There are, some have used the raise hand. Dr. Ali. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Dr. Rashid, for presenting and moderating this session. My question to Mr. Imad, how was Russia's role and Turkey's role? Were they decisive in reaching a ceasefire away from the Egyptian role, which is said to have been the reason for stopping the Turkish advancement? As the Sisi put it, the advance towards Sirte was a red line. And also, what cost or price are the local people giving to the Russians and the Turks? أعتقد أننا سنجيب.
طول ولا ناخذ مجموعة أسئلة؟
Do you answer each question or when it's posed, or do we wait for more questions?
Okay, I'll answer, just not the
Either
anytime. In terms of the, let's say, Egyptian threat back then, I know that the media was very savvy sometimes, especially Egyptian state media, at portraying the ceasefire as something that was Egypt manufactured. But the fact of the matter is, back then, it was primarily the Turkish and Russian, let's say, interventions, and first of all, interventions, and then bilaterally struck pullout of the Wagner mercenaries towards Sirte and towards the central Libyan region, which actually achieved the military balance. The fact that Sisi threatened was more symbolic from my perspective, than anything else. And even then, right now, you're actually seeing the fruits of the Turkish and Egyptian, so to speak, rapprochement that occurred after that. So it wasn't so much as a threat. It wasn't so much a threat as it was a basically symbolism in a way, and also even from a military, let's say, standpoint, from a military capabilities standpoint, and also from a American back then diplomatic perspective, an engagement on behalf of Egypt, on the Egypt's behalf and on Turkey's behalf against one another in Libya would have looked quite badly, because it wasn't something that America wanted to entertain, basically, at the time. And I think there was a paper, I forgot who the author was actually exactly, but that highlighted what Egypt needed to do, or its different options to actually enforce that red line in Sirte, and all of them looked quite unrealistic, basically. So there wasn't really an intention on Turkey's, at least, part. The domestic factions is a different story. Some of the domestic factions did intend to attack Sirte and capture it. But on Turkey's side, there wasn't an intention to transition from defense to offense. Basically, after the agreement with the Russians, the idea was to de-escalate and see where things would go. In terms of the UN Security Council resolutions, all of the players involved in Libya are obviously there in contravention of UN Security Council resolutions. But that's why I referred earlier to the erosion of multilateral norms as something which is influencing the modalities of interventionism that we see today. Because right now you're seeing this effectively being mentioned on media. There's open source information about it, etc., but no action being taken. In fact, most of the players are very comfortable boasting about it almost in a way, at least on the Turkish side. And on the Russian side, it's more implicit, but they also are quite comfortable where they are at the moment. And as you can see right now, from the political settlement perspective, there hasn't been any pressure put on these players to actually vacate or repatriate their deployed mercenaries and also their troops from Libya. So yeah, that's part of the reason why I mentioned that in the introductory kind of section of the talk. Hope that answered your question.
شكرا أستاذ عماد. Mr. David.
Mr. David.
Thank you very much, and first of all, for very interesting second day of the conference with thought-provoking presentations. And my question is to Dr. Thompson and Dr. Mansour. So I was fascinated by the point that Lebanon cannot be seen as a sovereign state as it is perceived through the Western lens of international relations. So my question is, what are the kind of international relations paradigmatic underpinnings of your assessment? And again, cannot we say that maybe those internal organizations or clans and external spoilers or whatever are not allowing the citizens of Lebanon to build a genuine sovereign state? So in order to assess whether Lebanon can be a state or cannot be a state, probably we need the variable, include the civil society, the people as a variable, and I'm referring to the Kedar revolution. So how would you assess the Kedar revolution in your formula with regards of the Lebanese system? Thank you.
Bill, do you wanna say something,
David?
Bill?
Please, Imad.
Sure. Bill, would you like to say something?
This one's in your ballpark.
Okay. So you mean from the paradigmatic, so the very really, traditional ways of looking at IR, if you want? All the paradigms and really most of the discipline makes some sort of reference to a certain understanding of the state. And understandably, that's important because it helps in theorization, right? So if you want to build sort of testable propositions or general really hypotheses, then you need your ontology to be very clear. So they've tended to really sort of looked at the state in a very certain way as having certain really capacities, having sovereignty, being recognized internationally. A lot of critical literature wants to re-engage this ontology. So this is the answer really to the IR paradigms, which we don't really work through. We don't think of them as very important ways of looking at the world really empirically. That's much more richer and more really theoretically informed way of looking at the world, which is what we do, empirical IR. So to answer your question on Lebanon, no, I do not think that really Lebanon is a state in the very traditional, Westphalian sense. If you want to look at the way that the system was built, there are many confessional communities in Lebanon. All of them have veto points over state quote-unquote decisions. Nothing happens if there's no agreement. And history since 1920 until now is a proof to that. That if this agreement falls, you don't have functioning institutions, right? So in that sense, my claim that there's no state in the Westphalian sense, most of the actors in Lebanon have played by the international recognition dimension, right? Meaning the UN recognizes Lebanon as a state, to draw resources from the United Nations, from the World Bank, from external really transfers. So it was a lucrative business. So why not really do that? Now, did they have intentions to build? I cannot really talk to that. We can't measure or really quantify intentions. But the politics of the country in the past 100 and so years clearly states that there's been waning interest at best to create, quote unquote, a modern coherent state. Now, you pose a very important issue, which is a subject that I'm doing research on really separately from this, so we can really talk about it if you want, which is the 2019 Syrian revolution. This, I think, has the potential to be transformative to the political system, meaning it's a shock that has the potential, again, it didn't do yet, to change the power really system in Lebanon and who makes the decisions, and for there to be clear, quote unquote, citizens in Lebanon, meaning individuals whose the system caters to, regardless of their affiliations, and who are able to play really a role in changing really the trajectory of politics. Is there an external really pressure? Yes, there might be. But if I want to talk about the agents of change, I can't always say that there's somebody outside that's really preventing them. That's the discourse of many Lebanese for decades, that it's the wars of others on our land. But this is an old really discourse, because there are many opportunities for them to work together, and they failed to do that. And it was clear that they were not interested really to do that. Will things change? I don't know. So I hope that I answered, but if you want more on the Syrian revolt, we can absolutely talk about it as a side note. Thank you.
Mr. William, would you like to add anything?
No, I think that takes care of it.
اوكي. السؤال الثاني لمهند سلوم. تفضل.
شكرا دكتور راشد. أرحب بالصديق
Mr. Mohammed. I'd like to welcome Dr. Harith Hasan, my dear friend. I'd like to thank him for his intervention. Dr. Harith said that Iran did not interfere in Iraq for the sake of hegemony, but defensively. We call it advanced defense. Does Dr. Harith think that the advanced defense, the advanced Iranian defense or hegemony is short-lived, or is it on the long term and relates to different dangers and different Iranian interests that might morph into perhaps in the future, I don't want to call it hegemony, but perhaps a similar relation to what was between Syria and Lebanon in the past? Thank you, my friend, Dr. Muhammad. I am happy to see you. I said that the Iranians say that they are not hegemon. They try to combat or repel the American kind of threat, or try to surmount it in Iraq. But as far as the influence, the Iranian influence in Iraq, it indeed exceeds any other influence, including the American influence. And that's why I talked about Iran being a guarantor to elections, for example. As you know, Iraq is about to hold elections, and Iran is playing a role to help certain groups and to reach certain agreements, certain bargains, and so on and so forth. The question is, do we think that this hegemony is sustainable? I personally think that what we are witnessing in Iraq is similar to the Soviet Union's hegemony in the Eastern European countries. It is similar to a cold kind of war. It does not match the Syrian intervention in Lebanon. No, it is similar, but I think that it is similar to the USSR's hegemony over Bulgaria, the Ukraine, Romania, and the Eastern European bloc in the past, I think. With the disengagement on the part of the Americans, with not having a rival in Iraq, I think Iran has been successful in infiltrating every single position, the economy, the politics, the community, different communities in Iraq, and so on and so forth. And this indeed has made Iran having the upper hand in this formula. But still, it is a burden on the shoulder of Iran, because Iran is the guarantor of the political system in Iraq. But still, we had witnessed protests against the Iraqi elite, and the tone of the protesters has been anti-Iranian. So there is a burden that must be shouldered by Iran, and Iran must strike a balance between benefits and the cost. Dr. Abdul Wahab Qassab, happy to see you. You're one of the great experts in this region. Please, the floor is yours. Thank you, Dr. Rashid. I am happy to see you. I'd like to thank Dr. Harith for his paper. I think that 15 minutes was not enough to just touch upon the Iranian-Iraqi relationship. I think that one of the most important priorities of the Iranian foreign policy and the strategic planning is the utilization, because of the isolation that it feels internationally, and the aversion of a number of stakeholders to directly deal with it. I think that Iran has resorted to utilizing the non-state actors seriously and firmly in order to gain the fruits of such interventions and to have them as a bargaining chip in Iran's relationship with the West. Iran is indeed utilizing the relationship with the non-state actors resorting to soft power. The main objective of Iran and the big strategic objective is to get to the Mediterranean and to attempt to hegemonize or infiltrate Afghanistan to get a straight, perhaps line from Hindu Kush Valley up until the Mediterranean. Iraq and the non-state actors in Iraq is the second coin or the different coin of terrorism. I am surprised why we don't call them terrorist organizations, these non-state actors. And I have some reservations as far as Mr. Harith is concerned, because he said that they might become allies to the Iraqi government. I think these organizations are enemies to the government, to the state of Iraq, because they don't have allegiance to the state, to the government of Iraq, ultimately. The second issue is the soft power of Iran that exceeds the Orient. Here we can talk about the Muslim Brotherhood, fraternity, we can talk about Palestine, we can talk about the marginalized and so on and so forth. In one sentence, I would like to say that the militias, the non-state actors in Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen do reflect the foreign policy of Iran. Iran tries to utilize them in order to have a bargaining, in order to make them bargaining chips for its use in the future. Thank you. Do you think that Libya has drived a wedge between the Europeans and the USA, and even between some allies like the Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Egypt? I think the question is addressed to my brother, but anyone can answer. Imad, Dr. Imad?
Yes.
You get a question?
Did you get the question?
Okay.
No, I did not.
The question again.
Do you think that Libya has deepened the division between the European countries, Italy, France, and Germany on one hand, and the United States of America on another, or even between some of the allies in some cases like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and others?
توصيف يعني الحرب الأهلية لليبيا ممكن كان يتماشى مع فترة 2011.
From 2011 up until 2014, we could have called what took place in Libya as a civil war. Yes, and that in that area there was a confusion on the European level and a retreat on the American level. This is still there, but the stakeholders, the regional powers have interfered later on, and the magnitude has changed, as well as the approaches of intervention, especially in 2019, whereby a new chapter has been opened in the Libyan conflict. I don't think that anyone can call it now a civil war. But in answering your question, I like to say yes, but this is not the root cause. The root cause is the erosion of the multilateral norms. What's happening is that there is an impunity as far as the intervention is concerned. No one cares who how anyone does in Libya.
Slap on the wrist for what you do, and you can do things quite overtly almost with complete impunity. But I think what maybe is different in terms of the Russians, the Turks, perhaps even the Emiratis. I don't know about the Saudis or the Jordanians, but they do follow sometimes the Emirates in some, or at least followed before the Emirates in some of its vision, let's say, for the Middle East and North Africa, is that the Europeans and the Americans did not have a vision for what they wanted in Libya. Whereas these players, as flawed as their visions were, as flawed as their goals were, they had some of them. Some of them were obviously unachievable and maybe were based on erroneous analysis of the local landscape, but they had an end game that they sought to reach. Europeans and Americans didn't, basically, which is the difference, I guess.
شكرا جزيلا أستاذ عماد. أستاذ علي الوحشي.
Thank you, Mr. Ali Al-Wahshi, please.
تفضل أستاذ علي.
السلام عليكم. شكرا دكتور راشد.
Thank you, Dr. Rashid. I'd like to thank Dr. Harith Hasan for his paper. The Iranian intervention has been diagnosed, but the solutions are lacking. What about the Gulf states? Are they in danger as far as the Iranian intervention in Iraq is concerned? And what's the stance of the Gulf states vis-a-vis this issue? Yes, please. Thank you very much, Mr. Ali. I think that the bottom line in Iraq relates to what Mr. Imad has described as far as the Lebanese dossier is concerned. Yes, the central government in Iraq is feeble, is weak. There are competing sovereignties over sovereignty in the state of Iraq, and the Iranian influence had the upper hand and had infiltrated Iraq because of this very weakness of the central government. The Iraqi government can stand on its own 2 feet because it has the oil, and as you know, the oil is the main source of fund. The Iranians depend on Iraq more than the Iraqis depending on Iran, but Iran has set had a foothold in Iraq, and it expanded. Its influence has expanded because of the different actors. Dr. Abdul Wahab has called them non-state actors, but yeah, there are a number of actors. But still, when the Iraqi government has power over the legitimate coalition, I think this will make the militias weak. As far as the second part of your question, yes, I said in my intervention, the 2003 was a watershed moment because of the toppling of Saddam Hussein and his regime, because the Saddam Hussein regime, albeit it was weak, it resembled a barrier between the Gulf states and Iran. But when Saddam Hussein has been toppled, the Iranians came in and they spread their tentacles in Iraq, inching closer to Saudi Arabia. So yes, this endangers the Gulf states, but the tools that were used to confront Iran were erroneous, utilizing or resorting to sectarianism to confront Iran has been baseless. because as you know, the Iranians has some legitimacy to interfere in Iraq because of the Shiite population. And as you know, the Shia in Iraq are the majority, and they pull the strings of the army, the government, and so on and so forth. So they have the upper hand. The only way is to support the Iraqi government so that it might become sovereign and independent. This is a difficult path, but this is the only solution. Also, this would have ramifications all over the place. The end of the Pax Americana has led to a confusion, and there are a number of elements that we need to touch upon because there are plenty of implications of the would-be withdrawal. The last question: what are the geostrategic roles or factors as far as the Russian bases are concerned, and the gas and oil elements in all this formula? Any volunteers?
And I think it's partly relevant to Libya, so I'll take it. In terms of Russia and the Black Sea, I don't think that it is directly related to Libya, but that's part of the, let's say, problem, is that when it comes to Turkey and Russia's foreign policy, let's say, they don't operate on in the same way that, let's say, the Americans and the Europeans do. The Americans and the Europeans often compartmentalize files, sometimes at least, or try to compartmentalize files. So you'd have different people working on different desks that shuffle on a bi-yearly, etc. basis. So they have to get to know the file once again. At the level of Turkish and Russian foreign policy, first of all, it's quite centralized to an extent in terms of what is done and what is being considered. And then second of all, it's not very compartmentalized. So whenever there are regional meetings, etc., you'd find them speaking of Syria, Libya, Eastern Mediterranean at once, and they discuss the three files because they almost consider them interlinked. That complicates to a significant extent resolution, basically, but it makes it far easier for them to kind of broker bilateral arrangements. And that's part of the reason why also from our perspective, having a multilateral, let's say, solution to the conflict has become increasingly complex and drawn on other players like Greece, like Israel, like Egypt, etc., vis-a-vis the Eastern Mediterranean dynamic. And that's, one issue when it comes to conflict resolution. The other issue is, Dr. Harith mentioned the Civil War diffusion paper. And that's part of the reason why the Turks and the Russians intervened in Libya. It's their regional interest. It's not necessarily about what is going on in Libya itself. It's what the symbolism is in terms of security arrangements across the region, the end of the Pax Americana, etc. What type of framework will exist? Where will these players have influence? Whether they'll have influence in sub-Saharan Africa. You see that both Turkey and Russia are trying to make inroads into that area. And equally in the Mediterranean, they're trying to come to arrangements. And the issue, they don't mind coming to ad hoc arrangements that are unsustainable sometimes, basically, or that are at least unsustainable to those governed in the territories where those arrangements will occur. So Syria, Libya, etc. They don't mind sporadic eruptions of conflicts, reshuffling the cards, and then coming to new arrangements. And that often comes at the cost of, not Russian soldiers, not Turkish soldiers, but actually either the mercenaries they deploy or local populations that they effectively bomb, unfortunately, at least in Syria. In Libya, we're not there yet, but that might be the case if things remain the way they are and if they don't vacate the troops that they have there. But to sum up, basically, yes, it is part of the equation along with several other files, let's say.
شكرا أستاذ عماد. الآن كل متحدث دقيقة قبل أن أختم الجلسة.
Thank you, Mr. Imad. 1 minute for each speaker, and then we'll conclude our session. Dr. Harith? Nothing, just I wanted to thank the Arab Center for inviting me to participate in this session. I have benefited from all the papers. I think we need to focus on the internal wars or the civil wars in light with the regional system or the regional order, because the regional powers play a major role in building alliances and so on and so forth. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Harith. Mr. Wiliam Thompson, 1 minute. Any last sentence or intervention?
I would say almost exactly what the last speaker said. The upshot of what we're talking about is that many of the specific factors associated with any given instance of civil war is, of course, questionable. What needs to be worked out in more detail are the more general factors that link these things. And we're really on the ground floor of that. And hopefully in the next couple of years, we can improve on that information base.
شكرا. دكتور عماد منصور.
Dr. Imad Mansour, last word. Thank you. I'd like to thank the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies for this invitation. And in conclusion, I echo what my colleague has said. I think that we need to build the states in our region and to understand the civil wars and especially the foreign intervention before posing question about the capacity or the ability of Iran to spread its tentacles, Russia or Egypt. We need to ask why there is a motivation to lure or attract such powers. It's difficult to answer because some answers are entrenched in the system and the structure of certain political regimes. But we need to uncover this and get the bottom of it, and we need to work further. But in conclusion, would like to say that I'm happy to listen to my colleague. But at the end of the day, we need to link what is international, regional, and what is local to understand why the civil wars do start in the beginning. There are grievances in our societies that might lead to such civil wars. So understanding the historicity of these civil wars is very important. Dr. Emadeddin, 1 minute, please. No addition whatsoever. I would like just to thank Dr. Omar Ashur for the invitation and the Arab Center, and God bless you all. In conclusion, I'd like to thank the speakers, the participants, the viewers. I'd like also to thank my dear friend Dr. Ashur. I'd like also to thank those who work from behind the shadows, the technicians and others. Thank you. And it's back to you, Dr. Omar. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rashid, for running this session, for moderating this panel. I'd like to thank all our dear guests, Dr. Harith Hasan, Professor Wiliam Thompson, Dr. Imad Mansour, and my dear friend, Dr. Imad Badi. I'd like also to thank my colleagues, those who Abib Jawad, Mu'tad Nadar, and others, those who work on who have worked on the logistics, and also the translators who worked with us. Mr. Samir and Mr. Muwaffaq Tawfiq, the interpreters, and also all our followers. I would like just to remind you of tomorrow's session. We resume our talk about Iran and ISIS. It will be the fourth session of this conference, and it will kick off at 3 p.m. Haider Saeed will be running the show. Mr. Thomas will be talking about the partnership between Iran and the Houthis, and then we'll go east to Afghanistan and talk about the emergence of Taliban. Thomas Hamad will be talking about the possibility of the return of the Arab Afghans or the Arab fighters. Hamza al-Mustafa and al-Rifai will be talking about the Turkmenistan Islamic Party, the geopolitics. Nicola Madison will be talking about the impact of the foreign militants, especially in Afghanistan. And as I said, this will take place at 3 o'clock, which will tackle the issue of foreign fighters. Thank you very much for your listening, and have a good day, have a good evening, and peace be upon you.